Hi everyone, so I'm Claire from Biology by Claire, and today I'm going to be chatting with a former A-star student, Raghul, and we're going to find out all about what life is really like as a second year med student. Hi Raghul, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be back.
So, for the benefit of the listeners, where are you and what are you studying?
Yeah, so I'm a second year medical student at Imperial College London. Obviously, we're based at South Kensington, West London. So I'm living out in Shepherd's Bush, which is not too far. It's like a 30-minute commute from there. And that's pretty much it.
Okay, so has everything gone back into full swing in January or?
Yeah, it has gone back into full swing actually. I actually hadn't moved out for a while in second year because I hadn't found a place yet. So for the first kind of month of year two, I was actually commuting from Essex, which was very long because it meant that I had to be up at 6 a.m. to reach 9 a.m. That was very torturous. But then I found a place with a mate, and now we're living out. And they really have gone back into things. October and November, first term was really a chance for us to transition back into uni from the summer. And I think now they've kind of given us that grace period. They're fully just propelling us into the nitty gritty of it.
Perfect, thank you. So, if we go back a little bit in reverse, what was the first year like? So, you finished your A levels in the summer, and then when you got to university, what was it really like?
I think what they don't tell you about what it's like is how much of a leap it is in terms of the time that you have. You're so used to such a structured day, waking up to, get to school by 22. You have like, I don't know, section one, section two. You have your break, your lunch, and then you go home at 3:40, whatever it is. You have your homework for the day, then it's back the next day. But in uni, you're so like, there's so much self-control you need in terms of like, you have 24 hours a day to yourself. And what makes it really hard is it's not that they don't care, but that they know that you're an adult now, so they're not like on your case. They're not telling you to, get out of bed, get to your lectures, get to your tutorials. It's more of like you're mature now. You've worked really hard to get here, so we hope that you appreciate how hard you have to continue working. We're not going to coddle you. So it's a lot of, especially the first few weeks, we were trying to set our priorities straight because definitely, it's a completely new area. You're seeing a bunch of new people for the first time. There's lots of social activities, lots of like icebreakers. I think it's really easy to get your priorities mixed up and get distracted. And I do think every university student, for that matter, should get that chance to kind of experiment how to deal with their time. I certainly had that grace period myself. And I think after that, once you've really settled down, found your friend group, found your structure to your day, I think after that, it's just smooth sailing from there.
Okay, that's interesting. So, did you feel prepared for that? So, you said you had, for the first time, you really had to structure your day. Were you ready for that? Was that something that you were anticipating? And what kind of plans have you put in place to deal with that?
So, I mean, I wasn't ready for that at all. I mean, most of the times we'd end uni into by maybe 2, 3 in the latest. And on that day, we maybe have like 2, 3 lectures, maybe 4 if we were really, really like packing it in. But after 3 p.m., we'd have nothing to do until the following 9 a.m. And it's like, at least in my course in terms of medicine, we don't get assignments, we don't get homework, we don't get any form of formal assessment until the very end, until the final exams in the summer. Which I know I have my own thoughts on that, which is different to other medical schools and other courses. But really, they don't. We have no like reason to kind of do work apart from our own making sure we don't get fall behind. So I think I really struggled that in the first few weeks in the sense that I couldn't find myself having a reason to sit down, put my head down. Whereas in secondary school, in sixth form, we'd have, our unit tests, we'd have our mocks, we'd have our predictors, we'd have this constant kind of reason and like a constant goal. But in first year, when they just told us, okay, you know what, here are your exams, they're in May, that was like, okay, May, that's like 8 months away. What am I doing? Doing work in October. And I really let myself get into that habit for a few weeks. But then it's after I, started talking to a bunch of people and they were like, okay, you know what? Don't let yourself get behind. Don't let yourself miss these lectures, these tutorials. Especially over Christmas, I kind of had to reel it back in and try and bring a bit of a structure to the day.
What was it that made you realise that you needed to do that? Because it's quite an honest appraisal that you just gave. What made you realise that something had to change?
I think it's just an appreciation of how much content there is in terms of medicine. I would always say this is like the degree itself, you don't have to be particularly like intellectually smart or really profoundly like have a way of thinking, like courses like maths and computer science, it really is just how good you are at memorizing stuff. And obviously that goes for the whole degree as a subject. But we have A level biology, which is a whole like encyclopedia full of knowledge, like that massive 700-page textbook. But then you take like year one of medicine, and any year of medicine for that factor, you kind of multiply that sevenfold. And it's like with A levels, the way we did it is we had like one topic, and we do that entire topic in detail, and then we finish that with the next topic. But in medicine, you have so many different lecturers. Imagine having like 6 different biology teachers. Like we had 2 who were teaching us 2 different things at once, and that was sometimes a bit overwhelming. Imagine having 6, 7 different teachers. Like in one day, you can have a lecture on gastro, neuro, and cardio all in the same day. And then you're having to go home and you have to learn everything. And then the next day, you have a 2-hour biochem lecture. So it's like throwing chemistry into it as well. You're not able to really sit down and be like, okay, you know what, let me just do all of gastro. Because they spread out the entire topic over maybe a month. But in that month, you do about 4 different topics. So it really is a factor of like kind of turning on your brain in those lectures and having a different way of thinking for each of those lecturers, because the lecturers themselves are completely different as well. You don't get to know them nearly as personally as I got to know you or my other biology teachers. It's very obviously the lecture hall, you're sitting a couple 100 meters away from them. They're kind of talking into a mic, reading off a script, it sounds like. And you don't have the chance to, put your hand up then and there and be like, oh, wait, I don't actually understand this. And because they go by so quickly, it's really hard to kind of be in that moment, which is something I feel I have to work on.
Oh, that was there was a lot in there. Thank you. That's really interesting. So, what do you do when you've had a 2-hour lecture, you've just been it's almost filled up with all of this new information. What do you then do? What do you do with all of that information? How do you process that and make it stick?
So, I mean, I think it's inhumane to be able to sit in that lecture and by the end of that lecture to be able to understand everything. It's really is for the Imperial, and I'm sure all the other unis, they record all their lectures. So you have like a video recording of all of it back. So obviously I go home and I watch that back, sometimes in like 1.5 times speed,
On the
1.7
same
times speed.
day?
Ideally on the same day, but sometimes if I'm catching up on previous lectures,
So you've been in a 2-hour lecture and then you come home and watch your 2-hour recording.
I play it faster, so it isn't necessarily a 2-hour recording. And honestly, it wouldn't actually be that lecture. It'd probably be like an older one because I'd probably be behind anyway. But it's the matter that I obviously watch the lecture back, try and annotate the PowerPoint if I can while they're talking, because there's a lot that the lecturer might say which isn't actually in the notes. Because, and this is one thing I love about Imperial, the people who teach the kind of lectures, it will be individuals who have a particular interest in that area. So, for example, we had a lecture on appetite the other day, and regulating your hunger, and we had a bariatric surgeon teach that. So obviously he had a lot more of insight into obesity, and he'd always throw kind of like extra facts and figures which aren't in the standard kind of Imperial PowerPoint. And it's always a bit of a grey area whether you need to know it or not, whether it will be examined or whether it won't be. But just for our own interest, I can't try and kind of listen to it and note it down. So the whole process is a lot lengthier.
And I guess that then makes it easier for you to remember the things you do need to remember because you found something interesting. You're now going to attach that onto to that memory. So that's good. So it does sound like you have a lot if you've got all of those videos to watch back as well. So you said about annotating. I can remember being at university and thinking, do I need to write this bit down? Should I be taking notes? You just said something, I've missed it, and you're looking at the person next to you to get it down. What's your process when it comes to note-taking actually during the lecture?
So this is actually a really good question because it completely depends on the lecture in itself. Like we could have an introductory lecture where it'd be going a lot smoother, it'd be really easy, and you just kind of sit back and be like, okay, he's not really saying that much. I can kind of note it down. He's not really saying too much, which isn't actually listed in the PowerPoint. So I can just kind of read off it and then it'll be fine. But then you get to a few like neurology lectures, for example, where they start talking about like really complex nerve systems and the transmission of like neurons firing, and you're kind of sitting there staring at this massive diagram. You don't know if you should be trying to pay attention to the diagram or try to pay attention to the lecturer. So sometimes I found myself, just putting the pencil down, just kind of sitting there trying to absorb everything and really just trying to understand, like looking down, being like, okay, can I actually make sense of it? Because what I found myself doing last year, I'd write down what the guy would be saying, but then while I was writing down the thing down, he'd be saying the next thing. And then I wouldn't actually understand what the next thing he was saying was because I was too busy writing down the previous thing. Exactly, and then as it collects, I'd realize I'd be like 10, 20 minutes behind. And then I'd learn pretty much nothing. So I think something I'm definitely trying to do a lot more of this year is especially with the lectures where I know I can't keep up, just kind of sitting there and trying to absorb the information. I know it sounds quite cliche, but trying to absorb the information and get like a basic understanding of it, so that when I go back and watch the lecture and actually make the notes, I'm not scratching my head thinking, okay, what does he mean by that?
So do you think notes are benefiting you then? Would you? So you're saying that you watch the videos sped up. So do you think it's actually listening to those and absorbing it that's benefiting you the most, or are you then taking extra notes on top of that?
As in, it's those notes which I think they kind of start the recall process. Because obviously you learn stuff from the lecture, but if you ask me, what was the lecture about, 2 weeks ago, I'm not going to remember it like that because all I've done is listen to the guy talk about it for an hour and a bit. But then it starts to get into the point where, you start making notes. And then from those notes, you kind of, okay, the next stage is making some flashcards. And then once you make those flashcards, then it's like, okay, now it's time for me to do that active recall process. And obviously, for me to do that recall, for me to make those flashcards comfortably to a point where I understand them, it's for me to be able to understand the content first.
And I remember when during A levels you were using Anki, weren't you?
I wasn't using Anki then, I was using Quizlet.
Quizlet, okay. And so would you still do that now?
I'll be honest, so first year I actually used Quizlet quite a bit. I'd say I wasted quite a bit of time in first year making a lot of my own handwritten notes. That's something which I felt like I needed to do, but I realized that when I did it at the end, it was just like I did it because I felt like I needed to as a checkbox. But then making flashcards was something which was much quicker and much more beneficial in the long term. I've started using Anki now in year two because that's like the general thing that everyone says to use, and they're both really incredible apps. I think it's just the idea of like picking up your phone or your iPad, and just when you have, I don't know, 10 minutes on the tube or whatever it is, just going through some flashcards. And honestly, the reason why I like Anki is it makes you rank how well you know the flashcards. So based on like a number system, and especially I used Anki for anatomy last year, because it's like a couple hundred images that you need to learn and label. And it's like I used them because I could just like rapid fire them. Like, do I know it? Yes. Do I know it? No. Do I know it? No. It's not more like for the biology side. Like there's like these massive paragraphs I need to learn. It's just literally recall, like the most simplest, purest form of recall there is.
So how do you do those massive paragraphs? That's what everyone's going to be wanting to know. So it obviously it works for these images, so you can just quickly check that you know. So what if you did have a big chunk to try and process and remember? What's your approach?
As in the first thing is obviously break it down into bite-sized, manageable chunks if you can, and then honestly stuff like stuff that I learned in year 10 and 11, like blurting, for example, just trying to write out everything and then covering up. I remember in first year it was the musculoskeletal subject, and they had us do the sliding filament model again. And unfortunately, I didn't actually remember much from A level about the sliding filament model. So it was like trying to recap everything again and learn about all the trope, like the myosin heads and everything. I found that just looking at a massive flashcard with like 9 or 10 odd steps, just what it weren't doing it for me. So I found that I had to like write it out, like cover it, write it out again. And then once I'd committed it to memory, at that point, then I could start using the flashcards because I could literally just recite it because that's where I needed to recite it from.
Okay. And did you ever try pretending that you were teaching it to someone else? Is that something that works for you?
As in, I do it where I was kind of telling it to myself. I was as in I talked to myself a lot during these revision sessions, especially if I was at home. I just kind of closed my eyes and imagine I was trying to visualize it. And yeah, I feel like saying it out loud. If I was too lazy to write, I'd say it out loud. Basically, if I couldn't be asked to pick up a pencil and just write and write and write, I'd say it out loud because then, especially for subjects which I knew quite comfortably, it's just as you said, a way of teaching it to yourself or a way of saying it out loud to someone else. It's just to consolidate your own information.
Okay. So what do you think has been the biggest challenge then since you started at Imperial?
In terms of academically, I feel like definitely being able to manage all the different like core subjects. Obviously, we have the main one, which is like the biology side of it. We call it bioregulatory systems. That's like BRS. And last year we had something called Principles of Medicine (POM), and that was like if you combined all the chemical part of biology together, so stuff like the Krebs cycle, the Calvin cycle, well, not the Calvin cycle, obviously, but the Krebs cycle, all the chemical stuff of it. And that was the whole other exam. And then you had anatomy, which was the third exam. Apart from that, and this year we have even more exams. We have an exam purely based on lifestyle medicine and prevention of like diseases. It's being able to manage and kind of balance the time I allocate towards each one. Especially last year with POM and BRS, they're two massive exams. And on one hand, POM's a lot shorter than BRS in terms of content, but POM is so dry to learn. It'd be stuff like there'd be some interesting stuff like immunity and bloods. Then there was like your basic cell metabolism and stuff like genetics, where you kind of sit down and it's so dry. So you kind of put it off and put it off and put it off. And you'd much rather, sit down and learn about the brain or do like the gastro system. And it's being able to prioritize based on your weaknesses and work your way backwards, not just being like, oh, you know what? I really want to revise this today. Let me do that. And instead saying like, okay, I should really be learning this because I'm struggling.
And I guess it would be easy for me to say you should really be tackling those things that you least want to do, but it's definitely easier said than done, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how do you overcome that yourself?
I think making a sort of plan where I'm balancing what I enjoy learning and what I need to learn is something I really needed to do, especially last year for POM, making sure that, okay, you know what? I'd rather learn BRS, obviously. I'd rather do stuff, but I also do need to get through this amount of content in this amount of time. So let me structure it in a way where I get through all the boring stuff out of the way earlier on in the day. So then I have something to look forward to. And for example,
What a good plan.
yeah,
I like that.
out of all three of them, I'd say anatomy was probably the most fun because obviously it's just like one, it's quite mindless. Like with the Ankies, I could just sit there eating dinner and just tap and be like, okay, I know what that is, I know what that is, don't know what that is, don't know what that is. I just kind of tap, and obviously I'd put that near the end because I can still do that when my brain is kind of rotting a little bit and I'm getting tired. Because it is literally just recall. It's not something like, oh, I need to explain this process or I need to explain all these steps. So that's something where like if I had the choice, I'd spend like 6, 7 hours a day just doing anatomy. But obviously, I don't have the luxury of that, and I've got all these other stuff to do.
So do the boring stuff first is the message that we're taking away from all of that. Sure. Definitely. Okay. And then so let's go back a lot further now. When did you first decide that this was going to be the journey that you were going to take? When did you first decide that you wanted to go to med school?
So I feel like I knew earlier than most. I was pretty certain on it within like early GCSE time, even before that. And really, it started off as like an elimination game. Obviously, when I was young, I always had what would I do as my dream career? And I had nothing. Mine was like designing games or something, because obviously I love playing games. So I just say designing games. But then I did GCSE computer science. I was like, yeah, no, I don't want to do any. I don't want any part of that. And I started doing like an elimination. Like I'm not really interested in physics. I don't really like chemistry. Biology is something I love doing. I love learning it. But I don't know if pure biology is something I want to do. I love, talking to people. I don't want something where I've completely cut all contact. I don't want to be sitting in a lab all day, just kind of mixing stuff and, poking at stuff. I want to be able to talk to people. And obviously that's the two, when you combine those two things, right, being able to communicate and talk to people and having an interest in like the way the body works, medicine really is one of the very few things that you can do. And then I kind of went into it more and more and I saw, what the life is like and everything that it involves and what you can do in terms of further studies, like stuff like surgery, stuff like research, therapy. I just thought, okay, you know what, there's so much scope for me here. Let me just take that step forward, and then wherever my heart goes, I could just kind of follow it from there.
Amazing. So you said kind of GCSE time. So was there anything that you did during your GCSEs which was kind of geared towards the journey? Did you do anything specific that was going to be helping you out, do you think?
I mean, I think that obviously the influence plays like a tiny part of it. And especially in my culture, the whole idea of medicine is something which is quite aspirational. And it was always something like, oh, if I do this, it'd be quite like, I'd be looked up to. And my parents saw that I had this kind of idea and they took me to these like taster sessions and these courses. And there's one which I remember quite distinctly. I think I did it really early. It was in like year 10. It was meant for year 12s. But my parents sent me and a mate in year 10. It was in some hospital up north. They basically talked us through a lot of stuff. They talked us through like taking a patient history. They taught us how to suture. They showed us how to use a stethoscope. Like they showed us all like the really, really fun, like cool stuff of medicine. Something that like a 15, 16-year-old would look at and be like, wow, that's such a sick course. Obviously, they're not going to show us like the pages and pages of notes we have to take because that's just going to scare us. But they showed us the really cool stuff, right? I think I managed to look at like a sheep's liver and like lungs, and I managed to like they gave us like a little toy stethoscope to take home and like use. And I think that kind of sparked the interest in me. And then, I started saying like, okay, this is something I'm interested in. I started talking to a lot more like doctors. Obviously, I'm the first kind of medic in my family, but my dad knows a lot of like doctors and surgeons. So I started talking to them. and kind of seeing the life they lived and how comfortable they were and how happy they were and how, more importantly, how satisfied they were with the work they were doing. It kind of made me be like, oh, you know what, this is something I could see myself doing. So then I just thought, you know what, it helped that I had a lot of friends around me, a lot of close friends who had the same like aspirations as me. That was just the kind of crowd I kept around, and we just happened to kind of take this journey on together. So we just thought, let's just see how far it goes.
Brilliant. So when you realised that, at that stage when you're doing your GCSEs, did you actively dedicate more of your study time to the sciences, for example, and like brush off history?
I
Did
think
that happen, or did you have the same work ethic for all of your subjects?
oh God no. Even before I knew I wanted to do medicine, I obviously had my interests. Like there was some subjects which I was naturally good at, like maths just came to me. Maths and English I was just comfortable in because I'd had a solid foundation, and stuff like the sciences in general I was quite good at. All three of them, physics, chemistry, and biology, I was quite good at. But obviously, I was more interested in biology, and out of all three of those, I'd say, especially during GCSE time, biology I had to pay a bit more attention to. And I think because of the out of necessity of the fact that I needed to spend more time on it, I managed to have more time to appreciate the actual subject itself. And I started doing a lot more reading outside of it. And it helped that, you know, my dad's a pharmacist, he was a pharmacist. So anytime I was learning something, he'd come see me and he'd be like, oh, you know, this, and this, and we start having a talk. And he'd, you know, feed me a little bit of like extra knowledge. And I might go tell my teacher and he'd be like, oh, that's really interesting that you know this. And he actually started recommending books to me. And I can't say I actually read them fully, but just kind of using avenues to kind of watch these videos and read these books and trying to keep up with what is actually going on in terms of the field of medicine.
That's a really interesting point that I want to go back to about the conversations you were having with your dad. That's so important. I think that people don't recognise the importance of that quite enough. What would you recommend to students who maybe don't have parents from the same background as your dad, for example? How could they go about having similar conversations?
I think it stems from the fact that we just had a shared passion. I mean, because I didn't really know his passions that well beforehand. He'd obviously be like, "Oh, you know, you could do medicine. It's an idea." But after that, I kind of learned more about him as a person. He told me like, "Oh, you know, I'm in IT now, but I used to be a pharmacist when I was back at home, and I've always wanted to do medicine." Like, so it kind of helped that we gelled along. I feel like with people who don't really have that, you know, if you have these passions, ask him about any friends that he has with these passions, any uncles and aunts that he might have, and kind of share that passion with them. I think it is really useful to build that bond with someone who's much more mature than you, who's been through all the nitty gritties of uni and adult life, and have now landed in a situation similar to where you see yourself in. And it's that kind of aspirational goal where it's like I'm talking to the type of person that I want to be in 20 years and seeing their ideologies, seeing their kind of morals. And I'm like, okay, how do I start instilling those morals into me now so that I can be the closest version of that person in the future? So I think it's really useful to have that kind of system. In terms of to answer your question, how to do it if you don't really have that support, I feel like your teachers are going to be your second best bet after that. Because obviously, a biology teacher is going to love his biology, a chemistry teacher is going to love their chemistry, etc., etc. So, you know, if you feel like, oh, you know, I've got really big interest in physics, but parents hate it, spend some time after lesson just talking to your physics teacher. There might be societies you can join during lunchtime after school where you can, you know, meet these like-minded individuals, and with these people you can, you know, do stuff outside of school and develop that interest more and more.
You ran MedSoc, didn't you?
Yeah, I did run Red Sox a bit.
Yeah. So tell us more about that and how that helped your journey.
I think obviously before I ran MedSoc, I was part of MedSoc in terms of like I joined the society and I was in their presentations. It was a combination of obviously everyone, all the medical students tell you to like, you know, personal statement, and they're like, from the outside perspective, they're just like, okay, make sure you're in MedSoc just so you can say it. And I'll put my foot down and say that's the reason I joined it initially. I just wanted to, you know, have something to talk about in the interviews. But then as I, you know, got to know the committee of that society really well back when I was in year 12, I gained an appreciation for how much they actually cared about the subject. And they got to the point where they just wanted to help us. And I found that with the knowledge that me and my peers had, you know, accumulated throughout year 12 in terms of applying to medicine, whether it came to interviews and like, you know, entrance exams, I thought, you know what, like, I'm not going to take this knowledge into the grave. I might as well share it out. And, you know, that's where the whole thing started. And then it just got to the point where we just had a lot of stuff we enjoyed talking about. I remember with a mate, we did this entire presentation on the history of medicine. So like talking about, different surgical approaches all the way back in the Aztec era and how that's different to, the robots that do surgery now. And I wouldn't even say I did that for them. It just gave me an excuse to kind of sit down and learn about this stuff. This was something I'd otherwise find time to allocate if I wasn't, giving a presentation. And it helps, especially those in year 12 who are kind of on the fence. They're like, oh, should I do it? Should I not? Should I do it? Should I not? Like showing them the kind of fun stuff, it kind of reminds me of what I had in that taster session all the way back in year 10. It showed me the really appetizing parts of the course. And if I kind of showed them this, then they'd be like, they'd be able to make their decision up for sure. Like, this is the best we have to offer. If you still don't like it, then obviously this isn't the place
It
for
might
you.
not be for you. That's so good. That's amazing. So, what advice would you give to students who are perhaps at a school where they don't have MedSoc?
Start one.
Start one.
Start
Yeah.
one. Like, I feel like it helped that you shared the same passion in terms of like helping these medical students and just any of these biology students. So we were able to, I was able to come to you to ask for like, oh, can you come supervise for this one lunchtime session? So it made it a lot more interactive. But I feel like I don't think a school's ever going to turn down an opportunity to, bring up like this cliche, this clique of students. So yeah, I mean, just start one and see where it goes.
Okay. And then in terms of the application process, when did that start for you?
So I mean, different people will answer the question differently, but I'd say for me, the application process really started all the way back in year 10 with work experience.
Did you keep a log of everything you were doing?
In terms of work experience, yes, I did. It got to the point where and this is what I'll say as well, it becomes significantly easier when you have these people with connections. Obviously, it's a lot easier for people whose parents are in the field, then it's very easy. But I had the next best thing, which is where my parents knew a lot of people. So I managed to have this opportunity to go and, talk to these people. And obviously, you get given this like 2-week allocation period to do work experience in year 10. And in that opportunity, just make use of everything in terms of work experience, I'd say is one of the most important things that they look out for in the interview, because they're trying to get an understanding of what you can appreciate from the job. The fact that, it's not as black and white as everyone says, it's not as like, sunshine and rainbows as everyone says it is, but it's to gain an appreciation that despite that it all becomes worth it at the end. So especially what I did, I had like multiple work experience kind of placements. Even during year 12, I shadowed a GP for a few days because they were locally near me. I managed to watch a few surgeries with one of my dad's mates who was on call one night. It's just kind of trying to reach out for these opportunities, and it's a combination of obviously one being able to see like, oh, teamwork is used here, leadership was used here, communication was used here, but also this one time I got to see a laparoscopic appendectomy, and to me that's just cool. Like I don't learn like, oh, the surgeon was a really good leader, he was really good at teamwork. I just looked at that and I was just kind of like, yeah, no, that's sick. That's a really cool thing to say. And just putting that in your personal statement, I think they've gotten rid of personal statements now, but just being able to mention that in the interview, like, oh, watching this surgery made me kind of look into it even more. And then maybe based on that, I kind of did that presentation on MedSoc because I was more interested. And it's little stuff like that they pick up on, those nuances in the interview, and they're like, okay, this person is actively reaching out to learn more about the course.
And they're the things that you can't make up, aren't they? The things that only you could know and talk about that you've actually experienced. And I think that authenticity comes across in interview. What advice would you give to students in terms of reaching out to get that kind of those placements that you were fortunate enough to find yourself part of? Are those people quite approachable? Is it an easy process? Because you just email them and they'll say, yeah, come along. How does it work?
It definitely is a very easy process in the sense that they're not going to be bothered by it. I feel like especially when you're talking to these younger consultants and these younger like registrars, one thing which I found even in my own like placement rotation in medical school, whenever I felt like I'm in the way or I felt like, I shouldn't be here, I just kind of remember that they were in the exact same position that I'm in now. So when you're talking to these like registrars and these on-call doctors and you're thinking, oh, I feel bad doing this, I feel bad, ask them if I can come shadow them for a bit. Remember, not too long ago, like 10, like 15 years ago, they're in the exact same position as you, calling these doctors up and being like, can I come, can I come? So hopefully you want to believe that they have this kind of sympathy for you, and most of the time they do. I know that at least for us, our kind of head of year 10 talked us through the process of applying, especially for medicine. There's like this NHS application you can do for work experience, where they'll submit you to this rotation for 2 weeks. And that is honestly more than enough. As in, I wouldn't say like, I definitely say in terms of work experience, quality over quantity, you don't need to say like, oh, I did 3 weeks of this, I did 7 weeks of that.
It's more like you say about the actual experiences and what the skills that you got and the things that you saw that you can
Sure.
actually talk about.
For sure. Really just finding like nuanced examples of, where communication was really well used, leadership, teamwork, those like buzzwords that they talk about in terms of like in the interview, oh, tell me about a time you saw communication, tell me about a time you saw this. And obviously you're only going to learn this by, doing these mock interviews, looking at these mock interview questions and seeing what they're looking for. And I think it's really helpful to know those types of questions before work experience, because then you know what to look out for in the actual ward and when you're talking to these patients, because then you can see like, oh wait, the way that doctor talked to that patient was fascinating. Let me write that down because I can actually talk about it if they ask me this interview question.
Wow. So, what was the interview really like?
Daunting. I mean, we had what I did 4 different medical schools. It was Imperial, KCL, Queen Mary's, and UEA, so in Norwich. And I think I'm happy that I applied to all 4 of those because I'd say no 2 of those interviews were the same at all.
Really?
Like for starters, UEA I had to actually go to the actual centre. So that was a whole trek and a half on its own. And that was 13 odd stations that I had to kind of hop in and out of. And the rest were a mix of panel and MMI. And it never gets less daunting the more practice you do. Like I will say like I spent a lot of time, doing mock interviews. Like I even did some with you, with my other biology teacher, with my peers. I'd say I drilled the life out of all the questions I had access to.
And did you do university specific prep as well?
For sure. So one of the things that I got recommended to do for a lot of the unis was to kind of look into the uni a bit more and try and be like, you know why this uni? Because honestly, as far as the interview is concerned, you're applying to 3 other unis, right? What is it about this uni in particular that you want? And even if this uni that you're doing the interview for, even if it's not your first choice, you got to sell it to them like it is your first choice, like it is your dream uni, because that's what's going to want. They don't want people that don't really care about being there. They want people who are like working really hard to be there. So I spent like it didn't take long to. I spent one night trying to collate like 6 or 7 points about what that uni in particular had to offer, which no other uni I applied to had. So stuff like teaching structure, when you do your hospital placement rotation, what kind of research they have to offer. If you want to be really, really like into it, you can look into the research they're doing right now, and you can even name drop like, I'm really fascinated by this individual doctor so and so, and their work on this, and it's something I'd really like to be a part of within this uni. And even non-medical so stuff like societies. This university has this society which I'd really like to be a part of. I haven't seen it anywhere else. The location, I feel like it'd be a really good location to be in. Really just selling it to them and being a bit of a beg, if I'm being honest, but you need that kind of balance of how badly you want to be there. So yeah, to answer your question, university specific prep is really important.
So, your interview at Imperial, how many people interviewed you?
So we had 2 stages for Imperial. I think it was the most unique in terms of we had stage 1, which is something called asynchronous, which is it's something you can never get used to. They show you like a recording of this pre-recorded person asking you a bunch of questions, and then you have to answer them yourself in the time you have given. So it's actually really weird. You have like the video playing up in front of you, and they'll ask you the question, and they'll stop and they'll wait, and then you got to like record it yourself. You're sitting by yourself. You're not talking to anyone, and it sounds really it sounds like you're recording a YouTube video or like you're recording a podcast even, except there isn't a person talking back to you. So that
So,
one,
no feedback. You're just saying it as it is and
and
hoping for the best.
yeah, and I feel like that goes both ways, right? No feedback is good because it kind of lets you get into that element, that kind of that zone where it's just like, okay, I'm not letting anything phase me, and get through the asynchronous interview with the loads of questions. And then that was
And what kind of questions?
oh, now you're really testing me. So there was obviously there was a why medicine question. There was a lot on work experience, especially. It was questions where they can't really ask follow-ups to, if you get what I'm saying, because with questions such as what is it about this uni that you really enjoy, they can ask follow-ups like, okay, tell me a bit more about this, tell me a bit more about that,
A bit
and
more probing.
yeah, so they ask quite general questions they can't really probe about, where people can say pretty much anything. So a lot on work experience. So tell me about a time. You saw communication, leadership. There was one talking about the different ethics, the medical ethics, the pillars. Which one you think is the most important to you? Talking about the different kind of niches of the NHS, stuff like compassion, helping others, the core values. stuff where it really is just trying to see, okay, do you know this? Like there'd be these buzzwords, right? Like ethical pillars, core values, stuff where it's like you either know it or you don't, and you can't really waffle your way out of it. So it's just like a tick box. Like, okay, this guy knows his stuff, or this guy doesn't know his stuff.
So when they ask you a question like which is your favourite one and why, I guess there isn't actually a correct answer, is there? They're just checking that you've actually put some thought into it.
Yeah, for sure.
That's
Like,
the message here, isn't it? For people who are preparing for this kind of thing, they need to have actually done the work.
definitely, and yeah, it can be scripted, but you gotta drill through it so much that it gets beyond the point of scripted that you can actually know it so well that you can actually pretend like you're saying it on the fly. And that's it requires quite a bit of finesse. It's something even I couldn't get used to until at the very end. Like obviously I'd had recordings of my most common questions, and even until like the 13th, 14th draft, I just sounded so monotone, like I was reading off a book. It's only when I fully just like did it, I don't know, when I was in the toilet, when I was taking a shower, eventually it gets to the point where it just sounds like you're having a conversation, and it just sounds unscripted and really natural. That's the stage you want to be at for most of the questions that you're doing.
And I guess one of the best ways to prep for that is being part of the societies and having those conversations so that it's not scripted. You're going to develop confidence by putting yourself in those situations, aren't you?
Yeah, for sure. Something that really helped me was we'd sit at evenings and I'd sit on call with a few of my mates. It'd be maybe three or four of us who were all applying to medicine at similar unis, and we just fire questions off each other. And I think in an ironic way that really helped because when you do it with your mates, you can't help but laugh. Like you can't help but lose absolute complete composure. So I think the way we found, like, if you can maintain composure and professionalism, and if you can ace it there, then there really isn't much where you can go wrong in terms of in a professional setting. Because even looking at their faces being all professional and like they after seeing them so unserious, it's gonna make you laugh. So it's like if you can ace it in front of your mates and like maintain your composure and be cool and collected there, then you can be calm and collected in front of a stranger who holds your life in their hands, basically.
So after the asynchronous, what's next?
They kind of let us simmer for a few weeks and kind of
A
worry.
few
And
weeks.
yeah, it was it
Wow.
was it was quite a long process, and we had a few interviews between that. But then we had our panel after that, and that was where it didn't last very long at all. I think that's a really scary thing. The panel, it was over in maybe 20-25 minutes, and that's crazy because you spend what months and months preparing for a 20-minute interview, and it's like that's the only chance you get. And for this one, yeah, it was 4 stages. And in this one, they asked a lot more case-based stuff. So it was a lot more clinical. They'll be like, okay, a patient comes in with these kind of presentations. What would you, as a student, what would you recommend? Like, what would you do? And it's a combination of like situational judgment and also just seeing how much you know. And I think this one, I'd say it was a lot more fun because I was
Because
allowed.
you actually did know some stuff that you could
Yeah,
show off.
but also I was allowed to be like, okay, wait, let me think about that. And it wasn't like, oh, wait, I'm gonna forget this. I'm gonna forget this. I need to remember that. I need to say that. It was a lot more like, okay, you know what? There's nothing I need to memorize or like recite. It's just I need to sit down. I need to calm down and use my common sense. And once you practice those kind of like situational judgment questions, obviously in the UCAT there are so many of those, so you know what's like the best thing to say and what's the worst thing to say. So they're not looking for the absolute best thing. They just want you to be in the right kind of process of it. And it's very similar to what I've heard about Cambridge interviews in the sense that they don't really care about the final answer. They care about the thoughts and the journey that you're taking to get to the answer because they want to know where your head's at. But there was also one point where, so I'll give you just one example. There was this one patient who had come in and she had a bunch of like, she was complaining about a bunch of stuff, but they ran a bunch of tests and there was nothing wrong with her. And they were like, "Oh, what should we do?" We are just like, "Okay, keep her in for monitoring, see how it goes, and then send her off eventually." And then they dropped a bomber of a question, which is literally just, "What is the name of the condition?" Where it's like, um, of the condition presented, and it's this thing called Munchausen syndrome, or like psychosomatic disorders, where you're kind of sick and tired of being at home alone, so you're craving this attention, so you come into hospital and you do that. But I just think it's crazy how they can ask a question like that. Like Touchwood, I knew that because I'd seen like TV shows and stuff where I'd seen it. But I knew many peers of my own who obviously they're in the uni now, but they didn't know it then. And for a question like that where they ask you what the condition's called, if you don't know it, you can't waffle your way out of it.
No way.
It's just you just got to sit there and be like, I don't know. And that was actually really mean because it was the last question we had. And I remember kind of finishing the interview and talking to people, and they were like, "Oh, I had no idea what that question was." Because at that point, you just start panicking. and I think that's just to test like your like how you are under pressure. So I think Imperial was quite cheeky for that, but it worked
But
out
you
in
got
it
through
worked
it.
out in my favor, and it worked out in other people's favor as well. I guess they probably didn't weight it as much as the other ones. It's just seeing like, okay, have you gone that extra step really?
Okay. So you mentioned something else that you needed to prepare for, the UCAT, which is what everyone goes on about. Can you really prepare too much for that or not enough? Or where's the balance? What advice would you give to the younger Raghul if you had to do it again?
Start earlier, first of all. I'd
Really?
say I don't think
Even
there's
more prep?
yeah, I don't think I think I started way too late, and I think a lot of people would agree with me in terms of starting too late. But it's a fine line because if you start early, you get burned out, and you can't
When's
don't
early?
have.
Like what year should you be in when you were?
Oh no, I think it is. You should be in. What is it? So you do it in the summer between year 12 and 13. I started in July, which gave me what like just over a month. But I definitely give yourself a month and a half because it gives yourself that acclimatization process to kind of ease yourself into it to do like okay first do like a few hours a day, then do a few more hours a day, and then just get into the whole like grinding session of it. For me, because I didn't have that luxury of the getting used to it, I started and I was immediately like okay, I need to mash out revision, I need to mash out questions, and that worked for me because naturally I was good at cramming. But for someone who isn't good at like putting their head down for however many odd so hours a day and doing it, it helps to have that period a few weeks before where it's a lot more cool, it's a lot more casual. You can kind of experiment with the question types. You can attend these webinars where they talk you through stuff. So I think my first advice would definitely be to where's it start earlier. My second piece of advice, obviously there are four areas, right? Was it decision making, quantitative reasoning, verbal, and abstract? You're going to be better at some areas and worse at some areas. Like I was really good at the maths one and the abstract reasoning one. I was like really good at those. And SJT and like the decision making stuff, I was all right at. Counterintuitive to what you'd expect, where it's like, oh, what focus on your weaknesses. One thing that people say in the UCAT is to focus on your strengths, because the standardized marking it drops really quickly from the top to like if you start losing a few marks. So you want to try and maximize how many marks you can get in the really good areas, and that helped because I got really good scores in those two. And it didn't matter that, like, for verbal reasoning, for example, stuff like comprehension, obviously, I wasn't very good at. I did slightly less
I
than
thought
that.
you would have been good at that.
I kind of fell off a little bit after GCSE English, but and that kind of stuff where I didn't spend that much time on, it didn't matter because I was so clear in terms of how good I was in terms of what was it, the abstract reasoning and the maths one. So I definitely say make sure you're not horrible at any of them, but if there are two which you really like and you really think you're really good at, practice those. Especially for stuff like abstract reasoning, that's the non-verbal one, where it's like a bunch of shapes and colors and stuff. They do repeat in terms of the question styles. Both that and the maths one, they do repeat. There's only so much they can ask within a certain number of time. Whereas for verbal reasoning, they can ask a whole load of passages, and for like what is it, decision making, they can ask a slew of questions. For the two like more technical ones, where it's more logic based rather than reading, like grind your questions out because they will repeat, and I had them repeat for myself, and it helped that I was so comfortable with them because I spent that much longer in them. That even if I was, not as good in the other two, because I was so clear in those first two to such a significant degree, it didn't even matter, and I got a really good score at the end.
And what about these students who perhaps aren't as good as you at managing your time when it comes to also having your A levels to study for at the same time? What advice would you give to them?
I'll be honest, I wasn't one of those people who was very good at managing it at the time. I think um, maybe not you, but the other biology teacher, he would agree with me in that I struggled with managing, especially during the mocks, because obviously my priorities were elsewhere in terms of I just really want to get these interviews, I really want to get these offers. And I really do think it comes from a place of managing your time. Obviously, med application is really important, but I found so many people get so carried away by that. And once they get their offers, they end up not making their grades, which I think is the most disheartening thing ever. Like, I've got a few peers who, like, they were predicted all A stars and they got offers from places like Cambridge and Imperial, but then they ended up getting a B. And it's stuff like that where it's like you work so hard and you clearly had the minerals to do it, but it's just you let yourself get a bit too focused on one thing when in fact maybe you could have spent a little less time. Maybe you wouldn't have felt as comfortable with the interviews. Maybe you wouldn't have felt as comfortable doing the UCAT and the BMAT, but it would have solidified your like A stars. And you got to think about which one would you rather redo, right? Like if you fail your A levels, you got to do everything all over again. But then if you fail like the entrance exams or don't get the interviews, but secure the A levels, you can keep those and reapply as a gap year student. And obviously, no one wants to think like that. I least of all wanted to think like that. But it just gets to the point where it's like your A levels are the most important thing, and people will tell you otherwise. Like interviews are the most important, offers are the most important. The reason you're in school is because of is for your A levels.
Would you agree that the message from teachers was very much A levels, A levels, A levels?
I remember having this talk where our teacher sat us all down in the assembly, and he was directing medical students or like med applicants in particular, and he was saying like, "Oh, I know you guys have the BMAT and you're going to be thinking about that, but make sure not to forget about your A levels." And I kind of went in through on it, out with the other, because
Because you're hyper focused on that one thing that you want.
But if anything, looking back now, I'd wished he drilled us a lot more from the beginning, like even from like UCAT days from September, being like, "Oh, remember, focus, practice," even if it meant like doing more unit tests to give us that kind of awakening, like, okay, you need to pattern up, you need to have an excuse to revise, and not just being like focus on your A levels. And I think in terms of what my school did, they did the best they could in terms of warning the students. But after that, they can't monitor what you do in your own time. You're in charge of your own time. So it is does just come down to the fact that how comfortable you are. And
So you would advise students to, when they are structuring their own time, what do you think the balance should be for preparing for those and your A levels? How would you fit that into a day?
I think the intensity should increase for the exams closer you get, obviously. So say, for example, our BMAT was in, I think, November. It's somewhere around the October, November time. And honestly, I started revising like at the beginning, like so September-ish, because that was a lot of like GCSE sciences where we had to like learn a lot of the content again. I'd say the earlier you start, the better you are, because the less priority you need to give to it. I'd say in terms of A levels, never give it less than 50% until the very end. I'd say, obviously, while you're in school, at least, at the very least, make sure you're doing that. And then once you come back from school, spend a few hours just kind of recapping and consolidating everything you did in school. So, like during your subjects, what you did, making some notes, doing some exam questions, just to kind of consolidate that. And then at the end, once you're happy, you can just kind of put that to the side and then be like, okay, now it's time for me to focus on something I have now. Because there's a BMAT, which is as an exam, but it nowhere near compares to like something like A level biology or even like AS biology, right? Like the content is so incomparable that it can't be justified spending the same time, at least in the beginning. So I definitely say, I don't know, maybe if you're spending like 4 hours a day doing work after school, right? Maybe do like 2.5 hours on A levels and then an hour and a half on the BMAT in the beginning. And then you want to, as you get closer and closer to the exams, you want to switch that out a bit. And then it might get to the point where, this isn't advised obviously, but the few days leading up to the BMAT, you just do BMAT. And I know it's not recommended, but I feel like with the pressure and the stress, you might not feel like you're doing enough. But then it gets to the point where like, okay, you got to acknowledge that, and then that means that you can't give yourself that break after the BMAT. You got to be like, okay, you know what? I'm acknowledging the fact that I didn't balance it very well. I let my A level slide a lot. Let me spend the next few days putting my head down and really just grinding it and making sure I catch up and come back to that level, so that after the new year, when I'm sitting my mocks, I'm not like, oh, I wish I'd spent more time on this instead of the BMAT.
Thank you. So when it comes to the skills that you developed during your A levels, so with a focus on A level biology, do you think that it's been the actual learning techniques and how you remember things that you've taken with you into university, or the actual subject content? Which one do you think the most?
Definitely learn a technique. I mean, as in subject content, it was there, but there's so much new content that it doesn't really matter. Obviously, there's stuff like, knowing how the immune system works, and it helps you have a decent understanding of it. But I'd say the two most important things: one, the learning ability, and two, the passion. I feel like that kind of passion of like being able to sit down for an entire day and be like, just do biology because I just like the subject. That's what you're gonna have to get used to, because once you get into medicine, that's what we were doing anyway. So even if you don't remember all the content of A level biology, which does repeat a lot, actually, it repeats more than I'd care to appreciate. It's like, especially in stuff like neurology and stuff like cardiology, a lot of it repeats in terms of the basic like growth structure of organs and stuff. It does repeat. And I'd love to sit here and say I remembered everything, but I'll be honest and say I didn't remember everything, obviously. So it helped that I still had those techniques in place, and I just had to hypercharge them to suit the kind of content demands. And also the fact that I had the passion and I didn't have to worry about, oh, I got to do chemistry and maths as well, I got to do my other A levels as well. Now it's just all I have to do is biology. It's like doing one A level just like on steroids, basically. So it's
So, what
just
would be your top three techniques? Maybe something that you used during A levels that you're still doing now. Are there three, or have you just got one process? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, no, I can talk about it. I think the phrase I'm going to say is going to sound really cliche, but I think that's just what works. So the first one, obviously, active recall, especially for these core content subjects. It doesn't help just to have an understanding of it. I know we can say like, oh, you got to understand the subject, you got to understand the subject. That's all well and good, but understanding the subject is going to get you the marks in the exam. You got to know what to say and like the very precise thing to say. Because at least for us, our questions, we have a load of questions which are worth very few marks. So we need to know exactly what to say to get those very few marks. So it goes beyond understanding the content and it goes into really knowing the nitty gritty of it. So the first thing I'd say to do that is active recall. And something that works alongside with it is spaced repetition. It's something which I didn't really understand in A level. I'll be completely honest. I didn't understand spaced repetition that much. But as I got into med school, it's something I've grown to appreciate a lot more because of how much content there is and really just realizing, as much as I hate to say it, the limits of my brain. Like, I wish I could learn everything once and know it, but I've got to learn it once, and then I've got to look back at it in a few weeks, and then a few weeks later, and then a few weeks later after that. And only then will I start to really understand it. So being able to structure your day and be like, okay, you know what, I'm going to do this course on, I don't know, like inflammation of the brain. And then, yeah, sure, I know it now. But if I just forget about it until the exams, I'm not going to remember it. So I'm going to do it in 2 weeks' time. And then, you know what, I know it a bit better. So I might do it in 3 weeks' time. And then now I know it really well. I might do it in a month's time. And it's being able to appreciate, like, okay, so this is quite an easy subject, so I can do it in a few months' time. But this, I'll be honest, I don't get it at all. So I'm going to come back to it, in 2 days or in a week. So I definitely say space repetition in coordination with active recall are the two which really fundamentally help you learn as much content as you can.
Amazing. And so, would you have everything written out, like a list of topics? Do you have a checklist at med school? How your teachers would give you like a personalised learning checklist? These are all the topics you need to cover. That must be huge.
So one thing I do wish we had in med school was like a specification, like a spec that we had in biology, right? I really wish we did have something like that. We have learning objectives, obviously, like the LOs that you see all the way since primary school, but I don't really read those because there's so many. Like each lecture has about 7 different learning objectives, and when you're doing like 20 different lectures a week, you just get behind the learning objectives. So I just do it based on the lectures. It helped that I knew, as in during first year, I got to know a lot of second years at the time. So now I have a lot of people in the year above who I use like as a support system. And when I ask them about, how to do second year, honestly, a lot of them warn me because second year they say is the hardest year in medical school because after from third year it's all clinical for us in terms of in Imperial at least. So year one and two are the preclinical years, and year two is like the most gruesome and the most grueling in terms of content. So she basically gave me a checklist of all the subjects, and then it was like a table. So it was like a list of all the subjects, and the first one was like lecture, Anki, recap one, recap two. So it's like I'd write the date down when I watched the lecture back, and then write the date down when I made the Anki and like kind of went through the Anki flashcards. And then obviously because I need spaced repetition, I do like session one, session two, session three to be like, okay, this is when I will look through it the first time, this is when I look through it the second time. So then when I've got the table out and I'm looking at, okay, you know what, I've had 2 sessions of this one, but I haven't had this one. I've only looked at this once. So let me schedule this in for next week. And vice versa, like, oh, I'm doing this too much. Let me like do this less because I know it's a fun lecture, but I know it well. I know it well anyway, and I should really be focusing that time on something else instead. So I think having that table out, it scares you because it kind of shows you how much there is, but it also just is important because I don't think the brain is capable of being able to balance a timetable to kind of sort out all 8 or 9 of those core subjects.
Okay. So, let's say a year 12 student's listening now. It's January. What should they be doing at this time of the year?
So at this time of the year, do they have mocks coming up? Or
Potentially.
potentially. So ideally, so if they're in year 12, they've done what, maybe half of the AS content, a good chunk of it. I feel like the first thing they should be doing right now is something I did. So get a specification, maybe just print out the pages that you've done that are relevant, get a bunch of highlighters and go through it. And the very first thing it's gonna be like, you're not gonna learn anything, but just kind of rank everything based on how well you know it. So like you can do the specification, or if you really want to do that, you can write it all out on an Excel and
And
color
would you
code it.
work ahead? Are you talking about year 13 content as well, or just year 12?
Well, year 13, you haven't done the content yet, so you don't know it. But I'm talking about content that you've already sat in a lesson for, that you've already sat through, that you've got notes on in your exercise book on. Sit through that and be like, okay, how well do I know this? Like, if I had to write out as much as I knew on a piece of paper, would I be able to fill the entire page out twice, or will I only have like a few sentences? So be able to coordinate like red, amber, green. Like, I know this well, I don't know this well, too. I know this really, really well. I'm just gonna ignore that for now. And then once you've done that, that color coordinating in terms of like how we've done it, I'd say an extra step you can do is rank them. Rank them in terms of, okay, these are, so I've got 4 subjects in red, which I don't understand at all. If I had to rank them based on difficulty, even in there, which one would I rank the hardest? And the one that you rank the hardest is the one that you do that day. Like, you start that immediately, right? And obviously, if you need a lot more extra support, then that's when you look to your support system. So you might go to your biology teachers, you might go to your textbooks, you might go to the internet, you might use, these external tutors that could provide you the support that you don't think you're getting in school, right? And I think just that ranking system, it's quite self-reflective because it makes you realize how much or how little you actually know. And it's really easy to get complacent and be like, oh, I've done half the course, when in actuality you've sat through half the course. But when it comes to how much you actually know,
How much of your mind was actually there?
yeah, chances are you're probably going to be disappointed. But that's only for now. That's why we're doing this, so you can turn that around and get that step ahead.
Brilliant. Okay, and now you're in year 13 and it's January. First exams on June the 5th. What are you doing now?
First time June the 5th. So ideally, content isn't done at this point, is that you're still going through the subjects. So I'd say obviously it's probably been a while since you've done the year 12 stuff. Yeah, I think it's suffice to say that like the year 12 content, especially stuff all the way back last year, like stuff like plant biology is probably a thing of the past. So definitely, I can't believe I'm saying this, but do the same thing again, but for year 12 and 13 this time. It'll be a lot longer. And I'm hoping that there'll be a lot less red in the year 12 section, a lot more like greens and maybe some ambers. And I think more particularly, there'll be stuff in year 13 that you don't get. Like, if I had to compare year 12 and 13, year 13 kind of went on to the more like nitty gritty stuff like the Krebs cycle, stuff like the stuff where you actually have to wrap your head around and kind of understand. And if you don't understand that yet, work on those. Because chances are they'll be mean, and the stuff that you don't understand, like respiration of photosynthesis, that's what they'll ask the questions on, right? And I'd say you're probably at the stage where if you've got quite a few ambers and greens, I'd definitely say you can start doing some exam questions just to see where your head's at. I was one who, at least all throughout A levels, I advocated for like exam questions and spamming the absolute life out of them, because as far as I was concerned, a lot of the exam questions actually came up again in a similar style. And obviously, I was able to do this because I was on top of the content. But the sooner you get done with the content and start applying it, I feel like knowing your content and applying your content for A level biology are 2 different things. Like, where subjects like chemistry and physics, the actual content's harder, biology might be a bit more easy to understand, but the application of the content to the examination is completely different. And I'm sure you can agree with me in terms of the mark scheme. It's like, it sounds like a different language sometimes in terms of what you need to say to get the marks.
And I think that is one of the main problems, isn't it? You can use as many of those as you like, but they lack feedback.
Exactly.
So if you get something wrong, you don't know how to change your approach.
Exactly.
And what's going to be different. Everything you've said has been so informative. Thank you so much. I think my final question is going to be, would you do it all again?
Absolutely.
You would?
Absolutely, yeah.
Good. I'm so happy for you, and I'm proud of where you've got to. And I wish you all the success.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.